UNO has always been an expanding university, constantly moving forward. But as we move forward, we must also look back to where we began. Let's go back in time with the people who remember UNO the way it was. Join us for Reflections in Time.
It's a beautiful January day. In fact, it's January 19th, 1989. I'm Paul Borgie, and I am sitting in this lovely Health, Physical Education, and Recreation building here at UNO, a part of our growing and changing campus in this year, 1989. And I'm about to do, as I have many times in this room, another in our series we call Reflections in Time. Some years ago, I thought it'd be nice to get many of the people together who've spent so much of their life working night and day for this university, for its growth and its change. And so I started reviewing and interviewing various people, and I continue to do that, and I'm glad to say that today we're continuing that tradition with Harl Dalstrom. Dr. Dalstrom is a professor of history and has been for lots of years here at the university. Harl, we're going to get into that, and I'm glad you could come by on this beautiful January summer-like day and talk about a little of your own past and, of course, the past of the university as you remember it. Now, let's go back in memory if we can begin. And first of all, Harl, where were your roots? I think they're pretty close to this campus, aren't they?
That's right, Paul. I was born in Omaha in 1936, and one of the earliest childhood recollections I have in life goes back to probably about 1940, when I recall coming out to Elmwood Park with my aunt and uncle one evening to get spring water.
Oh.
And in those days, it was quite the thing to do, to make a little trip out to Elmwood Park. I later found that the spring was contaminated, but somehow that's one of my earliest recollections of this part of Omaha. Not long thereafter, my family moved east, and I grew up in Riverdale, Maryland, which is on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. My parents were both employed in the District of Columbia government, and later on in my high school years I returned to Omaha.
What brought you back?
Well, basically it was our family had their roots in this area, and so in 1951 we returned to Omaha when I was 15, and I graduated from Omaha North High and then came to the University of Omaha in the fall of 1954 as a freshman.
Now, at that time, the campus even then had changed quite a bit from when you saw it as a boy, at least physically, hadn't it?
That's right. I had not seen it as a youngster prior to the time when we actually came back to Omaha, but by the early 1950s, we had, of course, the administration building, which dates from, 1938, and we had the field house from 1949, and except for the World War II structures back of the main building, that was pretty much it as far as our campus was concerned.
Those eternal temporary buildings.
That's right. The place called the Shack, where the students would eat, and there were a few other places which endured until the new parking garage was put in a couple of years ago.
Yeah, the Shack really was the forerunner of the big now student center.
That's right.
That was the social place for campus, really, wasn't it? Other than the dining room in the main building.
That's right.
But life really was over there on the east side of the campus then, wasn't it?
It really was.
Well, now that's a lot of years ago, Harl, when you were a young boy and a student just out of high school. If you can remember this, if there was a reason, and it wasn't always usual to go on to college in those days for lots of boys and girls, why did you decide you wanted to continue your education after finishing high school? Was it for parental reasons, or did you just want to come? How was it?
I really don't know. I suppose that I felt that if one were to make something of oneself in life, one had to go to college. And I wasn't really quite sure what I wanted to do in college, except that I did like to study history. I had found in high school through a couple of teachers who were University of Omaha graduates that history was very interesting to me. I might mention those people.
I wish you would.
One of them, Ellen Perry Gast,
yes.
who I believe was the head of our Alumni Association.
Yes, she was.
I had her for world history in sophomore year in high school, and also she was a journalism instructor at North, and I worked on the North Star. And so she was a fine representative of the university. And Miss Barrett, who also taught history, I had her for American history, and Ruth Barrett had received her master's under the direction of Professor Adrian, who later on would sponsor my master's thesis. And
so you got it started on Omaha University as a boy, really, by influence of these people.
That's right.
Isn't it interesting how those early teachers make such a difference to us?
That's correct. Fine teachers.
Now, you came out here, and now let's pick the memory a little more, Harl. We talked a little about the physical part of the campus. It wasn't big. We didn't have too many buildings, that sort of thing. But we had people.
We certainly did.
Now, we didn't have too many. About how big was the student body then?
You know, I remember seeing some literature back in those days that we had, I think in the fall of 1954, something like 1,875 full-time enrollment in the day program, and then roughly a similar amount at night. So probably if you took our total enrollment at that period, it was somewhere around 4,000.
At that time, the night and day enrollment were getting to be more like equal, weren't they?
There
was a time when the night enrollment was much bigger, wasn't it?
I'm not sure.
I think it was in the early 50s, late 40s, yeah. Well, now, you had teachers in those days on the campus, too, and people that you worked with as colleagues later on.
That's right.
What was the campus like then in student life and that sort of thing? What sort of things did you do? You went to class and that sort of thing. Think of the people, sort of the atmosphere in which you lived in those days.
Well, it was a very friendly atmosphere. Though it was an atmosphere that I suspect in many ways is not terribly different from what it is now. Most of our students, myself included, had part-time jobs. And I worked as a student in a hardware store, roughly, maybe 15 hours a week, all day Saturdays and most afternoons, as I recall. So we were off to our jobs, and I suppose in one way this is good, in another way it tends to erode the campus experience. But nonetheless, it was a very friendly campus, and you sense that in your relationship with the faculty.
Then, you mentioned the faculty. Name some of the people that you remember there that were your teachers and people around them in other areas of the college.
Well, I remember the first day I came here to register after I had decided to come to OU, and I had this sheet of paper that said, "See Mr. Beck, he is your counselor." So I didn't know him, but I went to see him, and as it turned out, I ended up taking a course on European history with him, also a course on American history with Professor Adrian, and they subsequently became friends, first teachers and later colleagues for the rest of their lives. And so that very first semester, fall of '54, these two gentlemen made a profound impact upon me.
Do you remember, too, in those days the campus was smaller, and not physically necessarily in terms of acreage very much, but in terms of people, faculty, staff, and students. Do you remember anything else about those days that was a little different from what it is today?
Oh, yes, indeed. One thing is the library. In 35 years, I've seen 3 libraries here. And in those days, the library was a closed-stack facility on the east end of what is now Arts and Sciences Hall. And it went, I believe, through all levels. And if you wanted to check a book out, you had to fill a slip out and take that slip up to the circulation desk, and somebody would go down in the stacks and retrieve the book.
There was no chance for you to go browsing around among the books, right?
No, no. And that was the way it was for the first year or so of my student days until, I believe, in December 1955, we moved into the Epley Library.
That was an exciting change, wasn't it?
Oh, goodness. And, you know, that was such a wonderful change. And you could go and browse, and later on, when I got into my graduate program, there were those wonderful things they had in the basement of the library, the old newspapers and the government documents, and gosh, that was a fantastic innovation. That was a great change.
You could really appreciate the difference, couldn't you, between the two, since you worked with it all. Now, as you went along with your undergraduate program, sounds like you moved into history almost right away. Is that so?
I did. I did.
And any special reason you think why you just ended up there? You've just been there most of your life?
Well,
those teachers that you mentioned back in high school, but were there other things too that kept you on this track?
I suppose I just enjoyed what I was doing. I never worried much about jobs. Just never gave that terribly much concern.
Didn't worry about necessarily what you were going to do.
No,
later.
No. I just figure, well, I'll finish my undergraduate degree, and then somewhere along the line I heard that after you do that, they got this thing called a master's degree. I thought, that'd be a nice thing to have one of those. And then I heard there's this thing called a PhD. Well, I guess I'll get one of those. And I never really gave much thought to earning a living and getting ahead. I figured that if you had a university degree, that those things would take care of themselves. And you know, in the 1950s, a college degree was kind of a union card to the middle class.
It was not as usual for degrees to come around with everybody in the neighborhood as it is today, right?
I think that's true.
So you were kind of part of a select group as you worked your way through this. But like you say, you didn't worry too much about a job, and things seemed to work out. Did you really decide as an undergraduate early on that you wanted to do some more work like a master's program?
I think I did. Somewhere into my undergraduate program, probably toward the middle of it, I was giving serious thought to that. And another influence, I think, probably came from the humanities course, which was directed by Professor Wilfred Payne.
You must pause there, because for those who are watching this tape and don't know Wilfred Payne, I think you better go on with that a little bit, Harl.
Well, Wilfred Payne had a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and he came to the University of Omaha in the 1930s. And he was an extremely dynamic lecturer. He was a man of great talents, and I think one could say he did not hide his lamp under a bushel, as someone once put it.
That's a euphemism for being egocentric, right, Harl?
Right, right.
But he was a joy to be around, wasn't he?
He was an interesting guy, and I worked for him as a student grader for a time, and I also worked for him as I think they called them humanities fellows.
Yeah, he had those, didn't he?
And that was interesting. I took the humanities course in 54, 55, and I kind of liked it pretty well. And the spring of 55, I was asked would I like to be a humanities fellow. And that meant you conducted a discussion group once a week. And for that, you were paid $10 a semester. And over in my office, I've got that letter now. My first job with the university, I was paid $10 a semester, which is pretty low even by arts and science college standards.
But in those days, that wasn't bad, was it?
No, it
because
wasn't.
tuition. What was tuition?
Oh, that's funny. Tuition was $6 a credit hour.
So a course cost you $18 a semester, maybe $2-3 for a book, right?
You know, Paul, in those days, I can remember I would go down to Occidental Building and Loan with my mother at the start of the semester. We'd get out enough money to cover the tuition. And $150 would take care of a full load, and it would also take care of your books, which you bought in the bookstore, also over in the old building.
Yeah.
But can you imagine that? $150 take care of the whole semester, just about.
But yet, in those days, $150 out of the savings account was quite a hunk, too, wasn't it?
That's right.
For most people.
That's right.
Really, tremendous amount. But yeah, it was unbelievable in terms of today's world, in terms of the cost of books even, and that sort of thing. Well, Wilfred Payne was an experience, and to me, and I wonder if you would agree, he sort of was a picture of the professor, wasn't he?
Oh, he was. And you know, that humanities course was a tremendous academic experience. I think anybody looking at that from the vantage point of the 1980s, seeing what those people did there over, well, now nearly 35 years ago, would be very impressed. You had 3 lectures a week, you had a discussion section, you also had a tutorial appointment, which you met every week. And they had these ladies who were tutors. They were college graduates, and they were familiar with the literature in the course, and they would interview you for a period of about 10 or 15 minutes, usually once a week, to see if you had done the readings, and they would record a grade on the basis of the quality of your response.
It wasn't just a big class, it was individual relationships too.
That's right. It was a fine example of what creativity can do in the academic process.
I think it was a real emblem in the life of the liberal arts, wouldn't you say?
It was.
Give you the flavor of what he gave you?
That's right.
And in your readings and so on, yeah.
And it was not just Wilfred Payne, it was people like Ralph Wardle, who was an outstanding lecturer, Eugene Kingman, the director of Jocelyn, and I believe Paul Peterson from music. A tremendous course.
Now, you mentioned Dr. Payne, I'm glad you did, because a lot of people have no memory of him, and those that do fondly remember many of the things I think you suggested. Were there other teachers, too, that stand out that you'd like to mention before you leave your undergraduate program? Yes,
one I think that I remember very well is Robert Harper, who later went on to be the Dean of Arts and Sciences from 1960 to 1970. And I remember having his survey courses in American literature. And I think the nice thing there was Harper showed the interrelationship of history and literature. And I feel that he really embodied the arts and science tradition of the unity of knowledge.
Yeah, interdisciplinary activity, really.
That's
he
right.
Was a pioneer in that area, I would think, yeah. And to me, he was always a real example of a scholar, I think.
I remember also, quite fondly, a course I had with Bill Utley, TV Classroom on municipal government.
Yeah.
And Utley had been the coordinator of the Omaha City Charter Convention in 1956. And later on, in 1957, he taught this TV classroom course, and I believe it was done live at noon or thereabouts on KMTV.
Yes.
And I took that course, and much of our attention was given to the new city charter. Well, it was a very interesting course, and I enjoyed it, but little did I know at the time that later on I would be involved in that project and would write a book in which that new city charter, which Al Sorensen had so much of a hand in bringing about, would play an important role in my later work.
Points up how important the course can become.
That's right.
Later on.
That's right.
Well, it sounds like you enjoyed your undergraduate days.
I did very, very much.
Well, then that came to an end, though, and
Right.
I wasn't worried about his job, as he said,
No,
so, hey,
no.
let's keep going to school, right?
That's right.
And
That's
you went
right.
off where?
Well, I did a master's degree here, and
Right here.
right, and I had one of the early assistantships when we established a graduate. We called them graduate internships then in the
Yes.
history department, and right about that time, A. Stanley Trickett came to UNO, or I should say to OU. He came in the fall of '57.
Stanley didn't arrive. He really just came on the
That's
scene.
right. That's right. And until that time, there had been a Department of History and Government, one department.
Oh, they were together.
That's right. And then Stan became the head of the History Department, and I believe that Bill Utley headed Government.
Uh-huh.
And so the departments were separated then. Well, our graduate program, shortly after Stan arrived, really began to take off. And I had one of the early internships, and so I did my master's degree here and finished that in 1959, and then went to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And
Before you go there, though, any recollections, personal ones, of A. Stanley Trickett?
oh yes, he was an extremely dynamic figure, and you always knew that he was in charge.
That's the only thing he could be.
He was always in charge, and I have many recollections of Stan. He proved to be a good friend over the years, but one that stands out goes back to October of 1965, when Leland Trawick was being inaugurated as president of the University of Omaha. And
One of our spectaculars.
that's right. It was something approaching a coronation. And oh my goodness, that was quite an event out here in the stadium. And I can remember Stan carrying the university emblem that the chancellor wears around his neck. Stan was carrying it on some kind of a pallet, as I remember, leading the procession. And he
He'd be
had
the one for it, with his unusual professorial garb, too.
That's right. He had that British academic robe, and
Yeah.
oh my, it was quite a ceremony.
Oh, indeed it was, and he would fit the picture very well. Yeah, you couldn't miss A. Stanley Trickett.
That's right.
And that coronation that you mentioned, or the inauguration, was quite an event. We could
Right.
touch on that maybe later when we reflect on events around here.
Mhm.
But now let's go off in your graduate program to Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
You went over there and intending to get a Ph.D., and you did.
That's right. Did it in history. And, I enjoyed my years in Lincoln very much.
What years would they have been, Harl?
Well, I went down there in '59 and was over there full-time until 1963. And I had not finished the Ph.D. in '63, but I came up here to teach while I was wrapping up the dissertation.
Who talked to you about that? Was A. Stanley still in charge then?
Yes, indeed.
Uh-huh.
What happened was Tom Bonner,
Oh, yes.
member of the history department at OU, decided to run for Congress.
Yes, that's right.
Fall of '62. He ran for Congress, and so he had to take a leave of absence.
Right, he could not stay on normal faculty, right.
Well, after the campaign was over and he lost to Glenn Cunningham, as I recall,
Yes.
he, I gather, decided that he should not stay at the University of Omaha. And there were stories or questions circulating about whether he had been forced out.
Mm-hmm.
And the result was there was a vacancy. And I heard about this from my advisor at Lincoln, and the result was I became concerned. I didn't want to get into a situation where it might be a problem of academic freedom, and so I did a little bit of checking, and it was, from what I could find, not fair to say that he had been forced out. I think he decided that all things considered, a move was appropriate.
And he ended up making some good, strong moves academically and as far as administrative work. Yeah.
That's right. And he retains, to my knowledge, very fond memories of his years in Omaha. So I was offered the job in the spring of '63, and I gladly accepted after I found out that everything was okay here.
You came back really just a few years, short time really, before Dr. Bale retired.
That's right. He retired at the end of January 1965.
Yeah. Now, what was the campus like when you came back to it now as a professor?
Well, it had not changed tremendously, but in that period there had been some physical expansions, most notably Student Union and the engineering building. So physically, yes, it was getting to look more like a college campus.
Allwine Hall wasn't here yet?
Allwine Hall was not here, but in 1963 we had the old administration building, we had the field house, we had the Union, we had Epley Library, and we also had the engineering building. So
and we also had a bigger student body, didn't we?
We certainly did.
Now we were probably double from what it was for you as an undergraduate.
I'm sure, every bit, maybe more.
Yeah.
So physically it was growing, but it still retained, I think to this day does, a very friendly atmosphere.
Now, as you came back, you weren't a student anymore. You were part of the
faculty.
Right. So
that's right.
Your role had changed. You'd moved up front in the classroom.
That's right.
What sorts of things did you begin to teach? And was this really your first real teaching experience?
No. I had taught a basic course in American history at Lincoln the previous year.
And so you had discussions back here for Wilford
That's right. And you know, doing those discussion groups, and I did those from my end of my freshman year right on through the senior year. Just being in front of a classroom did a lot to make me at ease. I can remember the first time being in front of a classroom.
Was it
oh
tough?
My goodness, you just feel like you're going to fall apart with panic. But after a couple of times, I got that under control.
Doing it helps, doesn't it?
That really does.
So those experiences really helped you prepare, because you were spent most of your time in the classroom as a student until you became a teacher, really.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
What sorts of things did you teach as you came back? I imagine the department was getting bigger now, more courses offered, that sort of thing.
That's right. We had, when I was here as a student, we had about 4 faculty members in history. Now, in 1963, we had 8. And
doubled.
We still had quite, or the faculty still had quite heavy loads.
What was a normal load in those days for a teacher when you first started teaching here?
15 semester hours. My first semester...
5 courses.
That's right. I taught 5 courses, and I did history of Nebraska, history of China, 20th century America, and 2 sections of the American Survey class. Now, I did have, to help me, a graduate assistant, but still it was heavy load. Then, in that very year, President Bale introduced a transition to the 12-hour load. So the second semester, I moved to a 12-hour load.
That was quite a change.
That was
for a lot of the older professors.
That's
and
right.
new ones too, I suppose.
That's right. And, well, things were looking up, but poor Dr. Bale, he apparently believed that as soon as the 12-hour load came in, that the research productivity of the faculty would shoot upward. And I can remember one faculty meeting soon after that when he indicated that he was pretty upset that that had not happened.
Right away.
Right.
But at least we were starting to veer in that direction from what was basically a teaching school.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
As you came here, your job was to teach.
That's right, and you did a lot of that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But no time left for these other things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Who were other members of the department then, along with you? Some new ones that hadn't been here when you were a student?
Yes, RIT Gum had come the previous year in European history, and we had a couple of people who were here only for a couple of years, but we had the people who were here when I was here, or most of them.
Trickett was still heading the
Trickett,
ship?
That's right, and Fred Adrian, Roy Robbins. Roy Robbins, when I had first come here, was the director of the graduate division, but now he was full-time in the history department. Paul Beck was here, so some of the old hands plus some new ones.
That was an interesting experience for you to sort of put on the other shoe here, wasn't it?
It was.
Did you feel kind of out of place for a while as you moved into the professorial ranks with these men that had been your teachers?
That strangely did not bother me. I think that first year I was just so busy getting lecture material ready and having something to say in the classes that I didn't get into those finer points.
Yeah, 15 hours with new lectures every day. That's rough stuff, isn't it?
But you know, I remember one thing that was personally difficult, and that was whenever I would see Professor Wardle in the hallways. I found it difficult to say, "Hello, Ralph." I think I always called him Dr. Wardle, and I think eventually he maybe said something about that.
How about Dr. Payne? Did you ever call him Wilfred?
No, I don't believe I did.
No, I don't think I ever did either. Some members of his peerage that were about the same age might have, but most of us didn't. It's interesting.
That's right.
But did you like it as you started out? Did you enjoy it right away?
Oh, I did. I did. And I enjoyed it even more after I got my PhD dissertation out of the way.
Yeah, you were working on that at the same time as that first 15-hour load year, right?
That's right. So I finally finished that in 1965, and oh, that was a relief.
Now, that period that you mentioned was an interesting period here, too, for our university. Bale was going to retire. We had these problems with funding. You remember that period historically?
Oh, very well. Not always pleasantly, but very well.
Yeah, we were municipal, but
we
were having problems, weren't we?
What had happened, of course, was that we were funded by a local real estate tax levy, the mill levy. And
which hadn't changed for eons, had it?
That's right. It had been set at 2 mills in 1952 or thereabouts, and it was 2 mills in the mid-60s, and we were growing like a weed, and we just needed a broader base of support. And we tried to get the voters to approve a mill levy increase in 1966, and they turned it down. And we had tried in '63, and they had turned it down.
Do you have any opinions now as a historian, and in retrospect, you've done a lot with the history of our city and the area, why we never had a chance to continue really as a municipal school? Why did we get voted down? And at least one time, it was kind of soundly, wasn't it?
I think so. I am not really sure of that. I think that perhaps the public of Omaha did not sense that the university was approaching a crisis situation. Omaha voters will support tax increases if they truly sense that it's necessary. But if they don't, and there's other evidence to indicate this, they will turn down proposals for increases.
And you really felt, honestly, they didn't really think we needed it.
I think that they just did not know how bad the financial future of the university was.
Well, we tried to tell them the story, didn't we?
We certainly did. I don't think that it was Dr. Bale's fault or Dr. Trawick's fault, but somehow the message just did not get across. And I think there's another thing, too. That is, we had in Nebraska this horrendous property tax burden in those days. We had not gone to the sales tax. So close to the total tax burden fell upon property.
Yeah.
And as much narrower tax base than we have nowadays.
Right. Yeah, and don't you think, too, along that line, as we pause in that period of history when we weren't getting that tax addition, that was a contributing factor to Dr. Bale's retirement?
I suspect it was.
He retired at 65, but he could have easily stayed on if he'd wanted to till 70, I think, wouldn't you agree?
I would imagine, yes.
Yeah.
He was still a vigorous person.
Well, you know, in that period, too, Harl, another thing, and then I want to talk to you about student life a little more, if you would, from a professor standpoint and that sort of thing. We had a lot of activity generated in part by the famous state senator from out west, Terry Carpenter.
Oh, yes.
We ended up in a merger situation.
That's indeed true.
Talk a little about that, if you would.
Well, I remember that a few of us in the history department were not terribly enthusiastic about the merger.
A lot of people weren't.
And I can remember going to a hearing over at the Capitol in Lincoln. And Ert Gum and I were sitting in that hearing room, and the presiding officer asked the audience, all in favor of the merger, please stand up. Well, I think just about everybody else stood up but us. But then he asked all opposed. We sat there because we really weren't sure that we were against it either. We were very, we were very ambivalent on it.
Yeah. Well, for whatever reason, it took place, and it took place in a hurry.
It did. That's right.
Yeah. What do you think of the way it progressed and the way it was handled? What's your opinion on that, Harl?
Well, I've always felt sorry for President Trawick. I do not know the story of why he was driven out as president of the University of Omaha. He certainly had not come aboard with the idea that merger with the University of Nebraska was a good thing, but I don't know that that brought his demise as president, but he had great faculty support. You see, Trawick did much to, I would say, democratize the university, because President Bale, man of great virtues and tremendously dedicated to the university, he nonetheless had an autocratic quality about him.
Indeed.
And there was one way to do things, that was his way. If you didn't like that, you go elsewhere. But the university had rather outgrown that. Trawick knew this, and he was much admired by a good portion of the faculty. And so we were pretty upset with his departure.
And rather abrupt, and he wasn't here for more than about a year, was it?
That's right. Just a little over a year. And so I think that President Naylor then quite literally had to earn the respect of the faculty, because he had been in the Bale administration. And let me say about Dr. Bale that if ever there were a person who was a competent financial manager, it was Milo Bales.
He made a dollar go a long way.
Oh, goodness. Though he was autocratic, we had to have a tight ship here for this place to survive over those years. And he knew how to, as you say, get the most out of a dollar.
Yes, indeed. And yet at the end of the year, sometimes we get a little bonus, if you recall.
That's right. That's right.
And other little perks that would encourage us to stay with involvement, and the atmosphere that you described too is all a part. It's an interesting period. Interesting your observations about Dr. Trawick, because there are varying opinions on him and the time he was here, and what he did or didn't do. But you felt that really he did some good things to democratize our way of life here as a campus.
That's right. Just the atmosphere that he created, that faculty people should be properly consulted. And well, about that time we also had a movement whereby department heads were now becoming chairmen. And so departments were being democratized. And this was a problem of adjustment in the middle and late 1960s.
But 68, the merger was effected. It became the law of the state. And we were taken in, or they were taken in, or we were all a part of this big campus.
That's right.
And now we have been for lots of years, about 20 or more.
That's right. 20 years this past summer, and I remember the ceremony, as you probably do, out on the right out in front of the administration building on the 1st of July, 1968.
That was the merger day.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, I imagine you and a lot of people still had many questions.
That's right.
What's going to really take place? Well, how do you think it really went?
Well, as I look back on it now, I see that it was the only way to go. I think that the municipal university, as a phase in American higher educational history, had run its course, and the size of urban universities required a broader base of support. And so now, with all this good hindsight, I see it as inevitable. And, you know, you can say, well, this and that should be different, but overall, I think it has clearly been a blessing to the university. You know, we had reached a point under the old system where we were almost a private university in terms of students paying something like 70% of their total costs.
And that would have continued, or else we'd have quit, wouldn't we?
We would have just continued as a private school with subsidy from the taxpayers. We would have been very limited.
No, I think most people who've been reflecting with me here would tend to agree with the ultimate solution. But at the time, we had lots of questions. We hated to lose our individual status and a lot of other things, didn't we?
That's right.
But we've maintained our identity, even with a new name, don't you?
This is true, and the campus has grown and the faculty has developed. Though I would certainly want to pay tribute to the quality of education under the University of Omaha period. What we have now is more diversity, more buildings, larger faculty, more courses. And we needed that.
Yes. So we've gone with the flow and with the times, really, I think you're saying, aren't you?
That's right.
Yeah. Now, let's go back again in history. I know you brought a piece of paper along with you, because we're going to record a day in case you forgot some, but you've been using a very good memory so far. I'd like to have you touch on people. I think we've got a lot of buildings here, but the university is people.
Of course.
Students and faculty and staff. And some of them, I imagine, in your memory,
yes,
stand out
indeed.
as being really big contributors to this cause of education. Maybe you've talked about some, but maybe you want to talk about some other people that come to mind that are in memory for you, Harl.
Well, one person I remember from undergraduate days was Dean J. McGregor. You remember him?
Yes, indeed.
A very fine gentleman.
Oh,
and I think that he helped establish a good atmosphere. You felt as a student that you were important. I remember one time doing well in a course, and I got a personal letter from Dean McGregor.
Yes, sir.
And of course I remember Ellen Lord, the director of the University Library. I remember her especially in my earlier days as a faculty member. Very happy, congenial, helpful person.
Yes, indeed.
And I mentioned Ralph Wardle in passing. I think that Ralph Wardle and Roy Robbins, both of whom had published important works, helped us recognize that we really had people here at the University of Omaha who had national reputations.
Yes, they gave us some national stature, didn't they, really?
And though I never had a class with him as a student, T. Earl Sullinger, very prominent sociologist. Yes.
You have memory for many of the same people I do that go back even beyond my years when you talk about life as a student in part. Yeah. Now, you know, through all these years, it sounds to me, Harl, like you almost, although you didn't worry about it in those undergraduate days, you were sort of heading in the direction of teaching.
That's right.
Now that you've had a chance to do it for a lot of years and enjoy it and be honored for it in various ways, you know, I'd like to have you talk a little about this teaching business. What do you think are the main tools of what you feel are a good professor, a good teacher?
Well, I think first of all, you have to be interested in the subject and know the subject matter, have a passion for it. And I think if you're going to be a good teacher, it helps very much if you are truly interested in other people. But I think you do have to start with a love of the discipline, a curiosity, and of course, teaching is like any other profession. There are moments of it that are sheer drudgery. I mean, to this very day, I hate to grade examinations, and I don't know anybody that likes to grade them.
I don't know anyone that likes to take them either.
That's right. But recognizing that every profession or job has its dreary and downright unpleasant aspects, I've found over the years that to be a teacher is to be a perpetual student. And it's an ongoing process of learning. There's a joy in the learning, and there's a joy in sharing it.
That's an interesting way and a nice way to describe it. Have you mentioned all the people you came to think of, or have you forgotten anyone that you recall now that you'd like to mention?
Goodness, I'm sure there are many. I think the people that I worked most closely with, Professor Fred Adrian, Professor Paul Beck, Roy Robbins, Stan Trickett. My associations tended to run very heavily toward the history department. And you know, these are the people who, as a colleague, you had lunch with and visited with the most socially. But I have recollections of many fine people here.
A big part of our university community and our reason for being here are students.
That's right.
Since the early 50s when you were a student until now in the 80s when you're still a teacher. Have you seen a change in students? What are good students, average students, what are they like now compared to 60s, 50s, whatever? What's your opinion along those lines, Harl?
You know, Paul, I basically do not think that overall they are all that different now than they were years ago. Now, sometimes if you happen to read a bad set of papers, I would call that into question. But in my more reflective moments, I go back to when I was a student. Milo Bale got all the freshmen into the auditorium over in the administration building, and he got up and he said, "Look to your left. Now look to your right. Those people won't be here in 3 years." Well, later on found that every college president gives the same speech, but he was essentially right, because, you know, we had an open admissions policy. You came in here, and if you weren't intimidated by that fantastic placement examination which you took when you came to the University of Omaha, why, you went into your classes, and if you cut the mustard, that's fine. If not, well, you were one of those 2 out of 3 that didn't make it. And it's roughly, I suppose, the same today. I mean, in my classes, I have people who are highly motivated and others who I wonder what they're doing in college. And I think if you go back to the 1950s, we had the same situation.
So really, over the years, you don't feel there's been a great change? Students are
No.
students are students.
I find people who are very interested and who are very dedicated, and of course these are the people that it's the most pleasure to work with.
Yeah.
So I suppose that my overall judgment would be that basically things have not changed all that much.
As we look around today, we're working in a medium that wasn't here when we started at the university, television, working with some of our students
That's
to help
right.
make this reflection. That's a change. The computer is all over the campus now.
Yes.
Yeah. In offices, in administrative areas, and it's all around life. 10, 15, 20 years from now, when you and I are going to hopefully be enjoying some retirement, Harl, what do you think the educational picture for young people is going to be? Are colleges and universities going to be different places?
I suppose that in some of the outward aspects, the technology, they will be different, but still you're going to have people, some of them young people, but at a place such as ours, which has always had a very welcoming attitude towards students of all ages, they're still going to be confronted with the challenges of learning. There will be new techniques, I suppose, more of the audio-visual materials of education. But I think many of the basics will remain the same. I'm a little bit reluctant to predict these things because I find that any predictions more than about 5 years in the future are really scary and dubious.
Someone's going to watch this in 20 years and say, "Ah, yes, he was right." But now, one last look as we wind things up, Harl. You've spent much of your life here at UNO and the University of Omaha. On a personal basis, what has it really meant to you?
Well, it has meant a good segment of my life from the time I was 18 years old up to the present time, with the exception of the years when I was away in Lincoln as a graduate student, but even then I was interested in the university, and it's meant obviously a career, but it's meant personal associations, friendships with students and faculty, fulfillment in teaching and research. It's simply been a very major part of my life.
That's a nice way to put it, Harl. And it's been awfully nice to have you take time to come by and do a little reflecting with me on our time here. This place has been a big part of our lives, hasn't it? And hopefully will continue to be for many years to come. Thanks for being with me and reflecting on your time today.
Thank you. It's been fun.
As I said about an hour ago, it's January of 1989. And Dr. Harl Dalstrom and I, from our history department, have been visiting in a series that we call Reflections in Time.